What's going on, Bottom Line viewers? It's Mitch here of the Bottom Line View, back with another NFL Stardom and Situm, and it's the fantasy playoffs. It's week 14. This means I'm going to come in clutch for you guys, giving you the starts and sits for your fantasy playoffs to hopefully get you that fantasy championship. Before we get into the starts and sits for week 14, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for NFL content every single day of the week. All right, let's get into the video, starting off with the quarterback sits of week number 14 and the first week of the fantasy playoffs. Starting off with Philip Rivers versus the Washington Redskins. Philip Rivers has averaged 343 passing yards in his past 3 games, with 6 touchdowns on top of that. It seems like the Chargers offense is really on a roll with Anthony Lynn at the helm, and they've really figured out how to get the ball to Keenan Allen and Hunter Henry. I like Philip Rivers versus this beat-up Washington secondary. Alex Smith versus the Oakland Raiders. The Oakland Raiders have allowed 6 quarterbacks to finish top 9 in fantasy points this season. The Oakland Raiders really have trouble, to be honest, covering any person that plays in the NFL, period. Alex Smith had an awesome game against the Raiders the first time around. I expect it to happen again. They got back on track in terms of offensive production against the Jets. I expect another game in a desperate game against the Oakland Raiders. Derek Carr versus the Kansas City Chiefs. Derek Carr has passed for 417 yards and 3 touchdowns in that first meeting against the Chiefs. I think he has another good game here. Even though he's without Amari Cooper, who had a really nice game against the Chiefs, Michael Crabtree is back. He is motivated. He is back from suspension. And I think without Marcus Peters, the Chiefs' already terrible passing defense is even more up to a susceptible performance. So I have Derek Carr having a nice day here. Start him. I know you can't trust him as of late, but start him. Trust me. Matt Stafford versus Tampa Bay. Since week 6, he is averaging a NFL high 312 passing yards per game. Stafford's on a roll, even though he is a little bit banged up. Tampa Bay secondary is really, really bad. I expect Stafford in a game that the Lions must win to start this game, so I wouldn't worry about him so much playing. He is definitely going to play. It's just a matter of how well and how effective he's going to be. I expect him to be effective. That's why I have him in the quarterback sits this week. Jimmy G versus the Houston Texans is my sleeper start. The Texans rank last against quarterbacks this season, and Jimmy G has his second start of his 49ers career. I expect it to be a good one. He had 293 passing yards last week against a pretty good Bears defense on the road. I expect him to have another nice performance here, just maybe add a couple touchdowns, and then he could be a top quarterback for you. So I expect Jimmy G to be that sleeper quarterback this week that maybe picks you up a win if you're in trouble with a couple of tough matchups for your starting quarterback. My quarterback sits this week. Maybe you have one of these guys and you should pick up a Jimmy G. Cam Newton versus Minnesota. Only 2 quarterbacks have scored 20-plus fantasy points versus the Vikings this season. Cam Newton just doesn't have a ton of options to really go to in terms of his passing game. Yes, Greg Olsen is back, but he is injured, and how healthy is he really going to be this week? Plus, he's facing Harrison Smith, Anthony Barr, and Eric Kendricks. That's not a good matchup. And then you have Xavier Rhodes taking away Devin Funchess. I just don't see, outside of running the football, how Cam Newton's going to pick up fantasy points for you this week. Kirk Cousins versus the Chargers. Only one quarterback has scored 20-plus fantasy points versus the Chargers, and that was in week 1, Trevor Siemian. And in that stretch, they played Tom Brady. So the Chargers' passing defense has flown way under the radar. Plus, Kirk Cousins has like 2 backup guards playing tackle. Both his tackles are injured, his receivers are injured, his running backs are injured. Give this guy a break. I mean, he's trying to carry this team. It's just not happening, especially against the Chargers defense in LA that's going to be fierce in a game that they must win, with Bosa and Ingram coming for him in that game. Marcus Mariota versus Arizona. Mariota, just simply 10 touchdowns, 12 interceptions on the season. That is god-awful. They play a Cardinals defense that's pretty hot as of late, minus whenever they play the Rams. Mariota just hasn't had a rhythm when it comes to passing the ball. And I can't start him against basically anybody because I don't know when I'm going to get a decent performance out of him. Jay Cutler versus the New England Patriots. The Patriots have allowed the least amount of points since week 6. That is the best in the NFL, of course. And Jay Cutler he's more likely to throw 3 picks than 3 touchdowns. That's just what I'll say. Blake Bortles versus Seattle. The Hawks have allowed just 5 passing touchdowns on the road this year. Yes, Blake Bortles has been good, especially against the Colts as of late, but it's the Seattle Seahawks. Even though they are banged up, this is another game that's going to be tight. It's going to be defensive. It's going to be hard-hitting, and I expect the Jaguars to rely more on their run game than their passing game this week. My running back starting off with the Patriots combination of Lewis and Burkhead versus Miami. Since week 5, Miami has allowed the second most running back yards per carry, 4.7. Burkhead really finishing it in the red zone. Lewis getting it from 20 to 20. I really like this combination so far this year. They're really ramping them up in New England, and I think that this is the time of year where New England really starts to rely on their run game. Down the stretch, this is when run games become important. This is when defense and all the intangibles and all the things that the Patriots do well and put together come January start to show. And without Rob Gronkowski, I think they're going to rely on their run game a ton. Lamar Miller versus San Francisco. The 49ers have allowed 10 total touchdowns and the second most PPR points to running backs this year. Mr. Miller has been very consistent all year long, and against the 49ers, I think he should have another consistent game, maybe even a good game against the 49ers in a game that they might win. It's going to be pretty close, and I expect Miller to maybe even hit the end zone here. Alfred Morris versus the Giants. In their past 5 games, the Giants have allowed 6 different running backs to rack up at least 10 points. So that's more running backs than games. That's crazy. Alfred Morris had a really good game, a bounce back against Washington. It seems like they know what to do now on offense without Ezekiel Elliott. I think that Morris gets it going against the Giants as well in a game that they should win, that they need to win. Morris is going to be the driving force for this offense until Zeke comes back. Samaje Perine versus the Chargers. The Chargers have allowed the second most yards to running backs, almost 2,000 this season. The Chargers may be good against the pass, but are not so good against the run. Perine is really the entire backfield for the Washington Redskins. They can't go to Marshall. Thompson is hurt. Where did Kelly go? I don't know. Perine is the guy right now. Plus, they can't rely on their passing game as much because they don't have an offensive line. So I expect Perine to have a decent day here against the Chargers and be relied on heavily. Giovanni Bernard versus Chicago. No Joe Mixon. That means give me Bernard. Lots of action in both the pass and the run game for Bernard this week against the Bears in a game that they should also win. My running back sits, DeMarco Murray versus Arizona. The last time a running back ran for 75 or more yards against the Cardinals was week 7 with Todd Gurley. DeMarco Murray should have a nice game here, or a terrible game, I should say. The one that could have a nice game is actually his teammate Henry, who's been the better running back as of late. And Murray looks old. He's just not as productive as he once was, and the Titans just offensively are just not good, period. CJ Anderson versus the Jets. The Jets have allowed the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Yes, CJ Anderson had a nice game last week, but against the Jets, a team that's going to focus on taking away the run and forcing you to pass, I don't see it happening for Mr. Anderson. Mike Davis versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Hawks offensive line versus the Jacksonville defensive line just isn't a good matchup. Mike Davis, had a decent game last week against the Eagles. I see that more as a one-off, considering the Seahawks have been terrible with the run game all year long and are going to have to rely on Russell Wilson to make miracle plays to beat this defense. Carolina's running backs versus Minnesota. Minnesota has allowed just 4 rushing touchdowns to running backs all season. And Minnesota's just one of the top defenses in the NFL. Jay Stu has been inconsistent. McCaffrey has barely he's struggled between the tackles, to say the least. And the Vikings are going to force Cam to sit back there and pass against their secondary. Minnesota's running backs versus Carolina. Before last week, the Panthers were actually first in rush defense. Minnesota, Latavius Murray, he might score a touchdown, but I just don't see a lot of yardage against Carolina. I actually think that Case Keenum could have a nice game here with Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs against that secondary. I just don't expect their running backs to have a great game. Dez Bryant versus the New York Giants starts off the wide receiver starts of the week. The Giants defense has allowed a receiver to score or gain 100 receiving yards in 6 of their past 7 games. Without the Jackrabbit here, Dez Bryant should have a nice day. Dak should find him as he did last week, and this is a must win. This is when Dez should come up big. Michael Crabtree versus Kansas City. In Week 13, Jermaine Kearse and Robbie Anderson for the Jets had 17 catches against them. There is no Amari Cooper, meaning more targets for Mr. Crabtree, and also there is no there is no Marcus Peters, which means that the bad secondary for Kansas City gets even worse. Golden Tate versus Tampa Bay. This is the worst team against slot receivers in the NFL. Slot receivers have scored 8 touchdowns against Tampa Bay. Golden Tate is indeed one of the best slot receivers in the NFL. As long as Matt Stafford plays, put him in your lineup. Josh Gordon versus the Green Bay Packers. Flash is back, and the Packers defense is a defense that you want to start him against. The defense has surrendered 13 scores and the 4th most PPR points to wideouts this year. The Flash should have a nice game here and has been targeted like crazy since his return. Chris Hogan versus Miami. No Gronk. Chris Hogan back in the lineup. The Hulkster has returned, and Brady's red zone target of early in the season, people may forget how well Hogan was doing in the red zone, has returned. I think he gets in the end zone this week as long as he plays. My wide receiver sits Doug Baldwin versus Jacksonville. I'm just going to say one name, Jalen Ramsey. Devin Funchess versus Minnesota. I could say just Xavier Rhodes, but I won't do that to you. The Vikings defense has given up the 3rd fewest PPR points to the opposition's top wideout this year. Funchess is playing a guy that just shut down Julio Jones. I don't expect this to be a nice day for him. Cooper Kupp versus the Philadelphia Eagles. The Eagles defense has allowed the fewest catches and yards to slot receivers. It's not going to be a nice day to my buddy Kupp. The Philadelphia Eagles are going to be a motivated defense, a tough defense, and a ferocious defense coming after Jared Goff after a game where they were very, very, very upset of their performance against Russell Wilson. Marquise Lee versus Seattle. Seattle's defense has been surprisingly shut down without their playmakers. Yes, he had a good game last week, but I don't see it happening against Seattle. Seattle's too good of a defense. They're just too smart, and I just don't think that they will allow Marquise Lee to beat them, especially considering his quarterback's Blake Bortles. T.Y. Hilton versus Buffalo. Hilton is just too inconsistent for me to start him this week. If you are a team that is playing a high-seeded team, an unstoppable force, if you're the 07 Giants versus the 07 Patriots, and you need to come up with some sort of scheme to beat this behemoth of a team, then sure, start T.Y. Hilton, okay? Because, yeah, he has games where he goes off, but he also has 8 games with 4 points or less. That's the reason why most teams should be sitting T.Y. Hilton. My tight end starts this week, Hunter Henry versus Washington. In his past 2 games, he has 12 catches, 157 yards, and a touchdown on 14 targets. Again, like I said, the Chargers offense has started to get it going through the air. Hunter Henry's been the biggest beneficiary besides Keenan Allen. Cam Brate versus Detroit. Detroit has allowed 4 touchdowns to tight ends in their past 3 games. Cam Brate got back in rhythm with Jameis Winston back at quarterback. I think that continues against the Lions. Steven Anderson versus San Francisco. The 49ers have allowed 4 touchdowns to tight ends in their past 4 games. The 49ers just not a great defense. I think Anderson, the guy that's really been the go-to guy for Tom Savage, sad enough, should have another good game here. Ricky Seals-Jones, one of the best names in football, versus the Tennessee Titans. The Titans have allowed a tight end to score or gain 90 yards 3 games in a row. Seals-Jones, this is a nice matchup for him, and I think the Cardinals should be able to pass the ball against the Titans. Jason Witten versus the Giants. New York has allowed the most touchdowns with 10 and the most PPR points, 17 to the position this season. Jason Witten historically has been amazing against the Giants. I think you can count on him here in your fantasy playoffs. It's Mitch of the Bottom Line View. Hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit us up on social media. Go to our Twitter in the description. You'll see our Twitters there, at Mitch Milani. That's me. Follow me. I talk about football all the time. Also follow the Bottom Line View for the latest updates, and hit that notification bell so you know when we go live every single time. It's Mitch. Peace out.